The hidden battlefield, how China turned the chip war into a chokehold on global industry. A quiet crisis is unfolding in the heart of the global technology race, and its implications stretch far beyond what most observers have grasped. As Washington intensifies its campaign to isolate Beijing from cutting-edge semiconductor technology, China has unveiled a counter-strategy so effective that it's leaving Western industries scrambling. The Netherlands now finds itself caught in the crossfire, facing severe consequences for aligning with American efforts to restrict China's access to advanced chip-making equipment. So, what began as a corporate dispute surrounding a relatively unknown company called Nexperia has, morphed into something far more significant, a geopolitical chess match. This situation, it really reveals Washington's broader strategy of pressuring European allies into direct economic confrontation with Beijing. The objective here? Well, it's to maintain control over just how many semiconductors China can manufacture and, importantly, at what level of sophistication. But here's the twist. Beijing has responded by demonstrating something Washington didn't quite anticipate: the ability to paralyze entire Western industries simply by restricting supplies that European and American factories, well, they just can't function without. The automotive sector across Europe is already feeling the pain, and behind all those polished statements and diplomatic language, American officials are, let's say, scrambling to contain a situation that threatens to spiral out of control. And for the first time in this prolonged technological confrontation, Washington finds itself reacting rather than dictating terms. This struggle, it transcends the technical specifications of semiconductors or the economics of supply chains. At its core, this is about raw power: who wields it, who's watching it slip away, and who's methodically accumulating it without firing a shot or imposing a single sanction. So, what's emerging from this standoff is, well, evidence that the chip war has evolved into an entirely new phase. China is no longer playing defense, absorbing restrictions and scrambling to adapt. Instead, Beijing is setting the pace, dictating terms, and forcing Western nations to recalibrate their strategies in real time. Despite the export controls, the investment restrictions, and the carefully orchestrated alliances designed to contain China's technological rise, the West may have already surrendered the most critical advantage: control over the components that keep modern civilization running. Before we examine exactly how this power shift occurred and what it means for the global economic order, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are turned on. What's unfolding in this technological and economic confrontation will determine which nations dominate the coming decades and which find themselves increasingly dependent, vulnerable, and sidelined. The decision that triggered a crisis. In early October of this year, officials in The Hague took an action they considered both measured and necessary. The Dutch government issued an order requiring Nexperia, a semiconductor manufacturer with Chinese ownership, to divest its operations within the Netherlands. The official justification centered on national security concerns. Dutch policymakers argued that allowing a Beijing-linked entity to control critical chip production facilities posed unacceptable risks of industrial espionage, technology transfer, and potential disruption to European supply chains during any future geopolitical crisis. From The Hague's perspective, this was a defensive move, a way to safeguard Europe's semiconductor infrastructure from foreign influence that might not align with European interests. The calculation seemed straightforward: better to force divestment now than face potential leverage or manipulation later. But this assessment would prove catastrophically flawed. What Dutch authorities interpreted as a prudent security measure, Beijing viewed as an unprovoked economic attack. And the response came faster and more forcefully than European officials had anticipated. Within a matter of days, China's retaliation exposed a vulnerability that Western strategists had either overlooked or dramatically underestimated. Unlike household names in the semiconductor industry, companies like NVIDIA, which powers artificial intelligence systems, or Intel and AMD, whose processors drive personal computers and data centers, Nexperia operates in relative obscurity. Most consumers have never encountered the name. So why has this particular company become the focal point of such an intense international dispute? The answer lies in what Nexperia actually produces. Headquartered in Nijmegen, Netherlands, with manufacturing facilities spanning the United Kingdom, Germany, and multiple locations across Asia, Nexperia was originally part of the electronics giant Philips. The company was spun off as an independent entity in 2017, then subsequently acquired by Wingtech Technology, a major Chinese electronics conglomerate with close connections to Beijing's industrial development strategy. Nexperia doesn't manufacture the sophisticated, high-performance chips that dominate headlines, the kind used in artificial intelligence applications or advanced computing systems. Instead, the company specializes in something simultaneously more mundane and more essential: discrete semiconductors and power management integrated circuits. These are the unglamorous components that regulate electrical current, manage power distribution, and ensure that electronic systems operate reliably and efficiently. Every automobile navigating today's roads depends on these chips. Every household appliance, from refrigerators to washing machines, requires them. Every smartphone, laptop, and industrial machine relies on these components to function. They're invisible to end users, easily overlooked in policy discussions, but absolutely fundamental to modern technological civilization. Without the products that companies like Nexperia manufacture, contemporary life doesn't just become inconvenient, it grinds to a halt. This is precisely what made the Dutch government's forced divestment order so consequential. By targeting a company whose products touch virtually every major industrial supply chain on the planet, The Hague inadvertently triggered a crisis that would expose Europe's profound vulnerability to Chinese retaliation. The chips nobody talks about, but everyone needs. Listen to any speech from American or European political leaders discussing the semiconductor competition, and you'll notice a consistent pattern. The rhetoric focuses almost exclusively on advanced technology: artificial intelligence processors, quantum computing capabilities, cutting-edge manufacturing processes measured in nanometers. Press releases celebrate new fabrication plants being constructed in Arizona, ambitious projects planned for Germany, and strategic investments in Japanese semiconductor facilities. But here's the uncomfortable reality that officials in Washington and Brussels rarely acknowledge publicly. The chips that actually keep the global economy functioning aren't these technological marvels. They're the simple, inexpensive semiconductors that perform basic but essential tasks in every electronic device imaginable. And China has quietly secured dominant control over their production. To be absolutely clear, we're not discussing the processors that enable artificial intelligence or power supercomputers. These are the foundational components, the electronic building blocks that regulate voltage, switch currents, and manage power in everything from medical equipment to industrial machinery. They're not glamorous, they don't make headlines, and they're rarely mentioned in strategic policy documents. But without them, nothing else functions. This represents the critical blind spot in Western semiconductor strategy. While governments have invested tremendous resources and political capital attempting to prevent China from accessing advanced chip designs and manufacturing equipment, they've largely ignored the fact that the global economy operates on these simpler components, and those components are overwhelmingly produced in China. Current data from industry analysts at TrendForce and IC Insights reveals the extent of this dependence. China now accounts for approximately 43% of global integrated circuit production capacity. More significantly, Chinese manufacturers produce over 60% of all discrete semiconductors worldwide and more than 70% of passive electronic components, the capacitors, resistors, and inductors that enable circuits to function properly. In practical terms, this means the electronic components inside your household appliances, the chips in your mobile phone, and even the semiconductors in hospital diagnostic equipment are predominantly manufactured in facilities across Guangdong Province, Shenzhen, and Jiangsu. Even when these components carry Western brand names, whether it's Nexperia, ST Microelectronics, or Infineon. A substantial portion of the actual manufacturing takes place in Chinese or Taiwanese factories. This creates a profound paradox. Western nations are attempting to weaken and restrict the very supply chains they depend on for basic industrial operation. This is why major industrial firms like Bosch have issued stark warnings that Europe's entire automotive sector faces potential collapse if Chinese-owned suppliers like Nexperia curtail their shipments. If Beijing made the strategic decision to suspend exports for even a single month, automobile manufacturing facilities across Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States would face immediate shutdowns. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. It's a documented vulnerability. In 2021, when a fire damaged a single Renesas semiconductor plant in Japan and forced a temporary production halt lasting just a few weeks, global automotive output declined by more than 10%. That disruption involved one factory producing one category of chips. Now consider the implications if an entire nation, one that controls the majority of global production for essential components, decided to restrict exports through its ports. That represents the leverage Beijing currently possesses. Yet Washington continues to frame the competition primarily around leadership in artificial intelligence development. It's a dangerous misdirection. The United States is channeling billions of dollars into constructing advanced semiconductor fabrication facilities that won't become operational for at least 5 years, all while overlooking the most basic components required by industries today. It's kind of analogous to preparing for a space mission while lacking sufficient fasteners to assemble the vehicle. You can have the most sophisticated propulsion system ever designed, but it's worthless if you can't hold the structure together. Europe's approach suffers from similar shortcomings. The West has made this exact mistake before. Consider rare earth elements, the specialized metals essential for manufacturing permanent magnets, batteries, and defense equipment. For years, Western nations paid little attention as China systematically acquired control over more than 80% of global refining and production capacity. When Beijing even suggested the possibility of export restrictions in 2010, global markets experienced immediate panic. Prices spiked, and nations scrambled to secure alternative sources that just didn't exist. The same trap has been constructed again, but this time the stakes are exponentially higher. Every major sector, automotive manufacturing, consumer electronics, defense systems, medical devices, and energy infrastructure, depends on these lower-cost, high-volume semiconductors. Without them, not even power plants or emergency vehicles can operate reliably. The uncomfortable truth that few Western officials want to articulate is this: China controls what might be called the industrial oxygen of modern civilization. The United States can continue discussing supremacy in artificial intelligence development, but if Beijing decides to significantly restrict the flow of basic semiconductors, Western economies will experience systemic failure long before any advantages in advanced computing become relevant. And China can implement this strategy without military confrontation or even formal economic sanctions. All that's required is stopping the shipments. When former President Donald Trump sat down with Chinese President Xi Jinping in what media outlets characterized as a potential breakthrough for U.S.-China trade relations, many observers in Washington interpreted the meeting as a diplomatic victory. After months of escalating tensions and increasingly stringent export restrictions, Trump emerged from the discussions announcing that China had agreed to relax certain semiconductor restrictions and permit limited shipments of components to companies with American connections. On the surface, this appeared to represent meaningful progress, evidence that pressure was producing results. But a closer examination reveals a different story. China didn't surrender control or reverse its strategic position. Instead, Beijing simply chose the timing and conditions under which it would partially open supply channels. The power dynamic remained unchanged, or perhaps even tilted further in China's favor. In the days immediately following the Trump-Xi meeting, reports from Chinese state media outlets including Global Times and various industry publications suggested that Beijing had quietly authorized a select group of companies to resume exports of mid-tier semiconductors and essential electronic components to American and European manufacturers. These approved shipments included power management chips, automotive semiconductors, and certain categories of microcontrollers, precisely the components whose shortages had been creating the most severe disruptions in Western manufacturing. However, these authorizations came with explicit conditions attached. Companies receiving these shipments were required to demonstrate that their supply chains weren't connected to entities targeted by U.S. sanctions, and that the components wouldn't be used for military applications. In essence, China was maintaining its position as the gatekeeper, determining who received access and under what circumstances. The American side publicly celebrated this development as evidence that diplomatic engagement could produce positive outcomes, but the underlying reality tells a different story about where leverage actually resides. Washington has been desperate to alleviate the shortage of industrial semiconductors, particularly after months of production slowdowns affecting automotive manufacturers in Detroit and throughout Europe's industrial heartland. Trump's efforts to restart Chinese supply lines were driven less by strategic positioning and more by economic necessity. America simply cannot produce sufficient quantities of these basic components domestically, and without China's cooperation, production in critical industries could face renewed disruption within weeks. What makes this development particularly revealing is that China didn't need to negotiate any formal agreement or make significant concessions. Beijing used the meeting to project an image of flexibility and reasonableness, while maintaining complete strategic control over supply chains. Industry analysts from Bloomberg Intelligence and Nexperia have noted that Chinese officials view this approach as an opportunity to appear cooperative on the international stage while preserving their dominant position. In more direct terms, China is allowing Western economies just enough access to maintain their dependence. The symbolism of this maneuver carries significant weight. China is demonstrating to the international community that it possesses the ability to control the tempo of global trade, tightening or loosening restrictions according to its strategic interests. While Trump attempted to frame the outcome as a mutual step toward normalized relations, the underlying truth is that China now wields access to critical supplies as a form of leverage. Beijing is no longer simply reacting to Western policies, it's actively shaping the landscape. So yes, semiconductor shipments have partially resumed, but they're flowing again only because Beijing has chosen to allow it. The balance of power has fundamentally shifted, and decision makers in Washington understand this reality, even if they don't always acknowledge it publicly. But, the underlying reality tells a different story about where leverage actually resides. Washington has been desperate to alleviate the shortage of industrial semiconductors, particularly after months of production slowdowns affecting automotive manufacturers in Detroit and throughout Europe's industrial heartland. Trump's efforts to restart Chinese supply lines were driven less by strategic positioning and more by economic necessity. America simply cannot produce sufficient quantities of these basic components domestically, and without China's cooperation, production in critical industries could face renewed disruption within weeks. What makes this development particularly revealing is that China didn't need to negotiate any formal agreement or make significant concessions. Beijing used the meeting to project an image of flexibility and reasonableness while maintaining complete strategic control over supply chains. Industry analysts from Bloomberg Intelligence and Nexperia have noted that Chinese officials view this approach as an opportunity to appear cooperative on the international stage while preserving their dominant position. In more direct terms, China is allowing Western economies just enough access to maintain their dependence. Europe's industrial heartland under pressure. Set aside the carefully crafted official statements and diplomatic language for a moment. The real anxiety isn't coming from government ministries or policy think tanks. It's coming from factory floors and automotive assembly lines across Europe, where workers are watching their futures become increasingly uncertain. If China continues restricting the supply of these essential semiconductors, these workers face an existential threat to their livelihoods. This explains why European automotive manufacturers are sounding alarm bells with increasing urgency. Major producers including Renault, Volkswagen Group, and BMW have issued warnings about production delays, output reductions, and the potential for complete facility shutdowns due to missing Nexperia components and similar chips from other suppliers. These aren't optional or premium components that can be substituted or delayed. They're the inexpensive but absolutely essential semiconductors that keep entire production lines operational. When supplies are interrupted, manufacturing plants simply cannot function. That's what makes this moment so precarious for European industry. Supply disruptions originating from China don't merely create inconvenience or temporary delays. They strike directly at the industrial foundation of economies that have no readily available alternative suppliers. The Netherlands can nationalize Nexperia's facilities within its borders, but it cannot instantly replicate the Chinese manufacturing capacity that produces the actual components. Germany, finding itself caught in the middle of this confrontation, has been directly lobbying Beijing, not Washington, to restore normal supply flows. Consider the implications of that approach. Berlin, a close ally of the United States and member of NATO, is conducting direct negotiations with China, bypassing American channels, to secure access to automotive semiconductors. This represents a fundamental erosion of the influence Washington has traditionally wielded over its European partners. When Europe's largest economy begins appealing directly to Beijing for industrial relief, it signals that U.S. policy positions no longer carry the decisive weight they once did. China's counter-strategy demonstrates brutal effectiveness precisely because it doesn't rely on formal sanctions, tariffs, or overt confrontation. Beijing doesn't need to impose any official restrictions or make threatening declarations. All that's required is slowing shipments, delaying export approvals, or creating bureaucratic obstacles in customs processing. Every hour that passes without components costs Western industries millions in lost production, and those industries, facing competitive pressures and shareholder demands, inevitably begin turning toward Beijing rather than Washington for solutions. A dangerous pattern of dependency is already taking shape, one where European nations publicly maintain firm positions on national security and technological sovereignty while privately negotiating with China to keep their factories operational. The disconnect between public rhetoric and private necessity is widening, and it's Beijing that benefits from this gap. Germany's automotive sector, which has historically driven much of Europe's industrial prosperity and employment, finds itself particularly vulnerable. The transition to electric vehicles has created new dependencies on battery management systems, power electronics, and charging infrastructure, all areas where Chinese manufacturing dominance has grown even stronger. European automakers are simultaneously trying to compete in China's massive domestic market while depending on Chinese-controlled supply chains for components. This creates multiple pressure points that Beijing can activate if diplomatic or economic tensions escalate. The situation has progressed beyond a temporary supply chain disruption or a negotiating tactic. What we're witnessing is the gradual restructuring of economic relationships, where access to essential industrial inputs becomes a tool of statecraft. Europe invested decades building sophisticated manufacturing capabilities and engineering expertise, but those capabilities are increasingly constrained by dependence on components sourced from or controlled by China. The strategic miscalculation. The fundamental error in Western semiconductor strategy becomes clearer when you examine what policymakers prioritized versus what industries actually required. Billions of dollars have flowed into initiatives focused on reclaiming leadership in advanced chip manufacturing, the prestigious projects that generate headlines and photo opportunities for politicians. Meanwhile, The unglamorous but critical components that keep existing industries running received minimal attention until crisis forced the issue onto the agenda. This represents more than a simple oversight. It reflects a deeper misunderstanding of how modern industrial ecosystems actually function. Supply chains aren't just about having access to the most advanced technology. They're about ensuring reliable access to every component, from the most sophisticated processors down to the simplest voltage regulators. A manufacturing line doesn't operate at reduced capacity when one category of chips is missing. It stops completely.